The lake was my father's heart, and his father's before him. It was a 10-acre bowl of clear, spring-fed water, tucked into a fold of the Texas hill country, fringed with ancient cypress trees, whose roots tangled along the water's edge like old, arthritic knuckles. My grandfather had bought the 100 acres surrounding it, back when the land was considered too rugged for anything but goats and dreamers. He had built the small stone house I now lived in, and he had taught my father how to fish in the cool, deep waters of the lake. My father, in turn, had taught me. For me, fishing wasn't a sport. It was a conversation with the past, a meditation. It was the gentle lap of water against the side of my aluminum boat, the whisper of the line casting through the morning mist, the electric thrill of a largemouth bass hitting the lure. It was the one place in the world where the noise of my life, the complex equations and demanding data sets of my career as a hydrologist, faded into a simple, profound silence. The lake was a closed, private ecosystem, a perfect self-sustaining world, and it was mine, or it had been, until the Cypress Ridge development began to metastasize on the property line to the east. Cypress Ridge was one of those master-planned communities that appeared almost overnight, a sprawling suburb of identical, beige houses with identical perfect lawns, all governed by the iron fist of a notoriously zealous homeowners association. I had coexisted peacefully with them for years. My property was older, grandfathered in, and not part of their association. I was a quiet neighbor. I kept my fences maintained, my land clean. I was an anomaly they tolerated, but the leadership of the Cypress Ridge HOA had recently changed. The new president was a man named Harrison Blackwood, a retired oil executive with a face like a clenched fist and an almost pathological obsession with control and property values. Blackwood saw my land not as a historical homestead, but as an unkempt blemish on the pristine aesthetic of his community. He hated my wild natural landscape, the very thing I cherished most. He hated that he had no power over me. The fishing was what broke him. The residents of the houses that backed up to my property could see me out on my lake in the mornings. It became a point of contention for Blackwood. His first move was an informal one. He approached me one Saturday as I was repairing a section of my fence. He was flanked by 2 other board members, a silent, imposing security detail. "Mr. Jennings," he began, his voice a low, condescending drawl. "We need to talk about your activities." I knew immediately what he was referring to. "Mr. Blackwood," I said, keeping my tone polite. "This is private property. My activities are my own business. Not when they become an eyesore," he snapped. "The sight of your fishing apparatus, your boat, your tackle, it's all very rustic. It detracts from the premium lakeside views our residents were promised." I almost laughed. He was complaining about the aesthetics of a man fishing on his own private lake. "I'm afraid I don't see how that's your concern," I replied. His eyes narrowed. "Let me be clear. We consider your fishing activities a visual nuisance. We are formally requesting that you cease and desist." "A formal request?" I said, my politeness wearing thin. "You have no jurisdiction here. You can't request anything. This conversation is over." I turned back to my fence. I heard him take a sharp breath. "You will regret this, Mr. Jennings," he hissed. This is not the kind of community that tolerates nonconformity. It was a threat, plain and simple. I didn't know at the time how far he was willing to go. I just knew that a man who could get that angry about the sight of a fishing boat was a man with a deep and dangerous sickness of the soul. The first official attack came a week later. It was a letter from the HOA's lawyer. It was a masterpiece of legal intimidation, full of vague allusions to covenant violations and nuisance laws. It claimed that my fishing somehow violated the aesthetic standards of their community and threatened legal action if I did not remedy the situation. It was, of course, complete nonsense. Their covenants didn't apply to my land, and no court in the state would ever entertain a nuisance lawsuit based on the sight of a man fishing. I wrote a short, sharp letter back to the lawyer, pointing out the legal fallacies in his argument and respectfully telling him, in the most professional terms possible, to go pound sand. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought I had called their bluff, but I had made a critical miscalculation. I had assumed I was dealing with a rational actor who understood the rule of law. I was dealing with a tyrant who believed he was the law. The second attack was more direct. I came down to my small wooden dock one morning to find my boat. My beautiful 14-foot aluminum boat that had been my father's was gone. The rope had been cut and the boat had been pushed out into the middle of the lake, where it had been intentionally scuttled. I could see the glint of its hull in the clear water, 20 feet down. It was a deliberate, malicious act of vandalism. There were no witnesses. The sheriff's deputy who came out was sympathetic, but he said without any proof. There was nothing he could do. I knew who was responsible, but I couldn't prove it. The loss of the boat was a deep, personal blow. It was like losing a piece of my father all over again. But it did not stop me. I had a small inflatable pontoon boat in my shed. The next morning I was back out on the water. I was not going to be intimidated. I was not going to surrender my sanctuary. My defiance, my quiet refusal to be broken, must have driven Blackwood into a rage, because what he did next was not just malicious. It was monstrous. It was an act of pure, unadulterated evil. I came down to the lake one morning, and the water was wrong. It had a strange, milky chemical sheen to it. And then I saw them. First one, then another, then a dozen. The pale white bellies of my fish floating on the surface. They were all dead. The big largemouth bass I had been chasing for years. The fat, healthy bream. The catfish that lurked in the deep holes. All of them. Dead. I fell to my knees on the dock, a cry of pure, agonizing grief escaping my lips. He hadn't just sunk my boat. He had killed my lake. He had poisoned my father's heart, my grandfather's legacy. He had taken the one thing I loved most in the world and had turned it into a sterile, chemical tomb. The silence that had once been my peace was now the silence of a graveyard. In that moment, standing on the shore of my dead lake, something inside me changed. The grief and the fury merged, and they cooled into a substance as hard and as cold as steel. This was no longer a dispute. This was a war. Harrison Blackwood had just made an enemy of a man who understood water on a chemical, geological, and legal level that he couldn't possibly comprehend. I was a hydrologist. I treated and purified water for entire cities for a living, and I had access to a laboratory. That afternoon, I took a water sample. I wore professional-grade protective gear, not knowing what I was dealing with. I took the sample back to my company's lab, and I ran a full gas chromatography mass spectrometry analysis. The results came back in an hour. The substance in my lake was a highly concentrated commercial-grade copper sulfate algicide. It was a nasty, powerful chemical used to kill algae blooms in large industrial reservoirs. A single gallon of it would be enough to treat a 100,000-gallon swimming pool. The concentration in my lake suggested that someone had dumped at least 50 gallons of the stuff into the water. It was an act of profound environmental vandalism, and possession of that quantity of the chemical without a proper commercial license was a felony. The problem, once again, was proof. I knew it was Blackwood, but I couldn't prove he was the one who had dumped it. The sheriff came out again, looked at the dead fish and shook his head. "It's a damn shame," he said. "But unless you have him on camera doing it, I can't get a warrant." My hands are tied. But I knew something the sheriff didn't. To buy that much of that specific chemical, you needed a licensed vendor. And a vendor would have a record of the sale. I had what? Now I just needed the who and the when. Blackwood thought he had ended the fight. He thought he had delivered the killing blow. He had no idea that he had just handed me the one piece of evidence I needed to start a war of my own. He had poisoned my water, and I was now going to use my encyclopedic knowledge of water rights, of chemical hydrology, and of the forgotten history of the very ground beneath his feet to do the exact same thing to him. He wanted to play with poison? Fine. I was about to show him what a real expert could do. My revenge would not be emotional or impulsive. It would be a slow, methodical, and scientifically precise strangulation. It would be a masterwork of hydrological warfare. My first step was a deep dive into the history of the land, a process I was intimately familiar with from my professional work. Water rights in Texas are a labyrinth of arcane, centuries-old laws based on a simple, brutal principle. First in time, first in right. The person whose claim to a water source is the oldest holds the most power. I spent a week in the dusty basement of the county records office, tracing the deeds and water claims for my 100 acres and the surrounding land. My grandfather, I discovered, had not just bought the land. He had bought the senior water rights to the Trinity Aquifer springs that fed my lake. His claim, filed in 1948, was the oldest and most powerful water right in the entire region. It gave him, and by extension me, the legal right to a certain volume of the spring's flow, a right that superseded any and all later claims. The Cypress Ridge development, built in the early 2000s, had also drilled wells into the Trinity Aquifer to supply their community with water, but their water rights were junior, subservient to mine. For 50 years, this had never been an issue. The aquifer was plentiful, and there was enough water for everyone, but I had just discovered a lever, a legal mechanism of immense power that had been sitting dormant for half a century. The second piece of the puzzle came from my professional expertise. I was a hydrologist, but my specific specialization was in water treatment and purification, particularly for municipal water systems. I knew the exact chemical and mineral composition of the Trinity aquifer water, like the back of my own hand. It was beautiful, pure limestone-filtered water, but it had one notable characteristic. It was naturally high in dissolved minerals, particularly calcium and magnesium. It was what is known as hard water. It was perfectly safe to drink, but without treatment, it could cause mineral buildup in pipes and appliances over time. The Cypress Ridge HOA, I discovered, had a small on-site water treatment facility, a simple automated plant that used a standard ion exchange process to soften the water for their residents. It used a salt-based brine to remove the calcium and magnesium ions, a perfectly normal routine system, but I knew its weakness. I knew its secret vulnerability. An ion exchange system is designed to remove specific minerals. It is not designed to remove dissolved organic compounds, and I knew of a specific, naturally occurring, and completely harmless organic compound that, when introduced into a water system with high calcium content, would have a very interesting and very unpleasant effect. The compound was tannic acid. It's the same stuff that gives tea and red wine their color and astringent taste. It's a completely natural, non-toxic substance found in the bark and leaves of many trees, particularly oak trees, and my 100 acres of land was covered in ancient, majestic oak trees. The final piece of the plan came from the chemical analysis of the poison in my lake. The copper sulfate algicide was a commercial product. I found the manufacturer's datasheet online. It listed the chemical's exact unique isotopic signature, and it listed the 5 licensed distributors of the product in the state of Texas. I hired a private investigator, a grizzled, cynical ex-cop who specialized in corporate and environmental cases. I didn't tell him the whole story. I just told him I was an environmental consultant investigating an illegal chemical dump. I gave him the chemical signature, the list of distributors, and a single name: Harrison Blackwood. I want to know if this man or anyone associated with him or his landscaping company has purchased this specific product in the last 6 months. I told him, check every distributor on this list. I need receipts. I need a paper trail. He just grunted. It'll cost you, he said, but if he bought it, I'll find it. While the PI was on the hunt, I began my own project. A project of malicious hydrological compliance. My 1948 senior water rights gave me the legal right to my share of the spring's flow, but they also gave me the right to use that water for agricultural and domestic purposes on my own property before it flowed downstream or was drawn from the aquifer by junior rights holders. The law was on my side. I bought a commercial-grade wood chipper and a dozen large, food-safe water tanks. I spent the next 2 weeks harvesting. I collected fallen oak branches, dead leaves, and stripped the bark from several trees that had been damaged in a recent storm. I was creating a massive supply of raw organic material, rich in natural tannic acid. I then set up a simple gravity-fed leaching system. I filled the water tanks with the chipped wood and bark, and then I began to divert a small, legally permissible portion of the spring's flow into the tanks. The water would percolate through the organic material, becoming infused with the harmless, non-toxic tannins, before being discharged into a small holding pond I dug on my property. I was, for all intents and purposes, brewing a massive 1,000-gallon pot of oak tea. It was a completely legal agricultural process. I was creating a natural organic soil conditioner for my land. It also just so happened that the primary outlet for my holding pond was a natural, underground fissure that fed directly back into the Trinity aquifer, just a few hundred yards upstream from the Cypress Ridge community's wellheads. The private investigator called me 3 weeks later. I got him, he said, his voice a gravelly monotone. It wasn't Blackwood himself. He's not that stupid. It was his landscaper, the one the HOA has a contract with. The guy bought 60 gallons of the copper sulfate a month ago, paid cash, from a distributor in Waco. Said it was for algae control in a private stock tank. But the guy's primary business is mowing lawns in a subdivision. He doesn't have any clients with stock tanks. And the best part, the landscaping company is owned by Harrison Blackwood's son-in-law. I got the invoice, the payment record, and a sworn statement from the clerk at the distributor who remembers the guy acting nervous as hell. It's a clean trail right to Blackwood's doorstep. A cold, quiet feeling of triumph washed over me. I had him. I had the proof. I could go to the sheriff, to the Environmental Protection Agency. I could have him arrested. But that felt too simple, too clean. An arrest would be a legal process. It wouldn't be justice. Justice, I decided, was a dish best served cold and with a slightly bitter, earthy aftertaste. I waited. I let my 1,000-gallon tea bag steep, the concentration of tannins in my holding pond growing stronger each day. I monitored the water quality reports for the Cypress Ridge community, which were public record. I was waiting for the perfect moment. It came in the middle of a hot, dry Texas summer. A small heat wave had increased water consumption in the subdivision, putting more strain on their treatment facility. They had just completed their routine monthly maintenance, which I knew involved flushing their brine tanks. It was the moment of their system's greatest vulnerability. That evening, under the cover of darkness, I opened the sluice gate on my holding pond. 1,000 gallons of highly concentrated, but completely non-toxic, tannin-infused spring water flowed silently into the underground fissure and began its slow, inevitable journey into the Cypress Ridge water supply. I had not broken a single law. I had not used a single toxic chemical. I had simply engaged in a little organic farming on my own property, using my own legally guaranteed water rights, and I had just launched a chemical attack from which they had absolutely no defense. Blackwood had poisoned my lake with a sledgehammer. I was about to poison his entire community with a scalpel. He had wanted to control my view. I was about to control the very water that came out of his taps. The conversation, I decided, was about to be reopened. The effect was not immediate. It took about 12 hours for the tannin-infused water to percolate through the limestone and enter their well system. The first signs of trouble would have been subtle. A faint yellowish tint to the water coming out of the taps. A slightly bitter woody taste like weak iced tea. The residents probably wouldn't have even noticed at first. But the chemistry, the beautiful, inexorable chemistry, was already at work. Tannic acid, when it comes into contact with the high concentrations of calcium ions in the hard aquifer water, undergoes a process called chelation. The tannins bind with the calcium, forming a microscopic insoluble precipitate. A fancy way of saying it creates microscopic brownish-black specks of mineral organic gunk. It's completely harmless to ingest, but it is an absolute nightmare for a municipal water system. The first real problem would have been the laundry. The tannins have a powerful staining property. Every load of white laundry in the entire Cypress Ridge community that Tuesday morning would have come out of the washing machine a dingy, streaky, brownish yellow. It would have looked like it was washed in mud. The calls to the HOA management office would have started around 9 a.m. Confused, angry residents demanding to know why their expensive white linens were now the color of a dirty paper bag. The real chaos, however, was happening inside their pipes. The microscopic precipitate, that insoluble gunk, was beginning to accumulate. It was clinging to the inside of every water pipe, every faucet aerator, every shower head, every valve and every toilet in all 300 homes. It was like slow-moving cholesterol, clogging the arteries of their entire water infrastructure. By noon, the water pressure in the homes at the far end of the subdivision would have started to drop. Showers would have been reduced to a pathetic trickle. Toilets would have taken 10 minutes to refill. Dishwashers and washing machines would have started to fail, their delicate inlet valves gummed up with the sticky black residue. The community's private Facebook page, I imagine, would have been a glorious cascading waterfall of panic and rage. People would have been posting pictures of their ruined laundry, of the black sludge coming out of their taps, of their failing appliances. The carefully manicured illusion of suburban perfection that Blackwood had worked so hard to maintain was being washed away in a tide of brown, sludgy water. Blackwood's first reaction, I'm sure, was to call his water treatment plant operator. The operator would have been completely baffled. His system was designed to remove minerals, not dissolve tannins. The tannin molecules were flowing right through his ion exchange resin beds, laughing at his brine flush. He would have tested the water, found it to be bacteriologically safe, and declared that the system was operating normally. Blackwood, in his arrogance, probably would have assumed it was a temporary natural phenomenon, an algae bloom in the aquifer or something. He would have sent out a reassuring email to the community, telling everyone to remain calm and that the discoloration issue was being investigated. But the problem wasn't going away. It was getting worse. Every day, I was brewing and releasing a fresh batch of my organic soil conditioner into the aquifer. The concentration of tannins in their water supply was steadily increasing. The water was getting darker, the taste more bitter, the sludge thicker. After 3 days of this, the entire community's water system was in a state of catastrophic failure. Appliances were breaking down. Hot water heaters were failing, as their heating elements became coated with a thick insulating layer of baked-on gunk. The immaculate white porcelain of their toilets and sinks was now permanently stained a sickening shade of brownish yellow. The financial consequences were beginning to mount. Appliance repair companies were having a field day. Plumbers were charging emergency rates to snake out clogged pipes. The local grocery stores were completely sold out of bottled water. The cost to the residents was already in the tens of thousands of dollars, and it was climbing every day. Blackwood was in a full-blown crisis. He had no idea what was causing the problem, and he had no idea how to fix it. He was forced to call in a team of professional hydrologists, a high-priced consulting firm from Austin. This was the moment I had been waiting for. This was the checkmate. The consultants arrived, took one look at the situation, took a water sample, and they would have known almost immediately what was happening. They would have identified the high concentration of tannic acid, and they would have recognized it as the cause of the mineral precipitation. But the next question they would have asked is, where is it coming from? Tannic acid doesn't just spontaneously appear in a limestone aquifer. It has to have a source, a massive, concentrated, and very recent source. They would have pulled the geological maps of the aquifer. They would have seen that the aquifer flowed from the west, directly from under my property. And they would have known, with absolute certainty, that the source of the problem was on my land. I can picture the scene in the HOA clubhouse, the consultants presenting their findings to a pale-faced Harrison Blackwood. They would have told him that his neighbor, the very man he had been tormenting, was conducting some kind of agricultural or geological process on his land that was introducing massive quantities of tannins into the aquifer. And then they would have delivered the killing blow. They would have told him that because my water rights were senior to his, and because I was not using any toxic or legally prohibited chemicals, that my actions were, in all likelihood, completely and totally legal. They would have explained that his junior water rights only gave him access to the water that I didn't use first, and that the quality of that water was not guaranteed. He was legally entitled to the aquifer's leftovers, sludge and all. Blackwood's only option, they would have explained, was to install a completely new multi-stage water treatment system, a system capable of removing dissolved organic compounds, a reverse osmosis and carbon filtration system, a system that would cost for a community of 300 homes somewhere in the neighborhood of $1.5 million. That evening, I received a phone call. It was Harrison Blackwood. His voice was not the arrogant, condescending drawl I was used to. It was a strangled, desperate whisper. "Jennings," he rasped. "You have to stop. Whatever you're doing, you have to stop it right now. You're destroying us." I let the silence hang in the air for a moment. "I'm not sure what you're referring to, Harrison," I said, my voice calm and neutral. "I'm just doing a little organic farming on my property, improving the soil, perfectly legal." "I'll pay for your boat," he blurted out, the words tumbling over each other. "I'll pay to have your lake cleaned and restocked. I'll pay for whatever you want. Just make it stop." "Pay for it," I said, letting a hint of cold fury enter my voice for the first time. "You think this is about money? You think you can just write a check and undo what you did? You killed my lake, Harrison. You vandalized my property. You tried to intimidate me, to bully me off my own land. This is not a negotiation." "What do you want then?" he pleaded, his voice cracking. "I want a conversation," I said. "A public conversation. At the next HOA general meeting, I want you to stand up in front of the entire community, the people whose homes are being ruined, and I want you to tell them the truth. I want you to tell them about my boat. I want you to tell them about the poison you put in my lake. I want you to confess. And then, I want you to resign. You and your entire board. If you do that, I will consider turning off my sprinkler system. The choice is yours." I hung up the phone. The trap was sprung. The tyrant was on his knees, and the price of peace was his complete and utter public humiliation. The week leading up to the emergency HOA meeting was, for the residents of Cypress Ridge, a week of escalating misery. The brown, sludgy water continued to flow, the repair bills continued to mount, and their frustration, which had been simmering for days, was now boiling over into open rebellion. Blackwood had no choice but to call the meeting. He was trapped between a community demanding answers and my non-negotiable demand for a public confession. The meeting was held in the high school auditorium, as the clubhouse was far too small to accommodate the enormous, angry crowd that showed up. I attended, but I did not sit with the residents. I sat in the back, a silent, impartial observer. I was not a member of their community, and this was their fight to win. I had simply provided the chemical catalyst. The meeting began with a presentation from the hydrological consultants. They laid out the scientific facts in a calm, clinical manner. They explained the presence of the tannins, the process of mineral precipitation, and the catastrophic effect on the infrastructure. They confirmed that the source was unequivocally the property to the west. And they concluded by presenting the two possible solutions: a complete $1.5 million overhaul of the water treatment facility, or convincing the neighboring property owner to cease his activities. The room was a tinderbox of fury. People were shouting, demanding to know who this neighbor was, what was being done. Then Harrison Blackwood walked to the podium. He looked like a broken man. His usual arrogant swagger was gone. His face was gray. His expensive suit looked rumpled. He stood in silence for a long moment, the angry shouts of his constituents washing over him. He had a prepared speech, a sheaf of papers in his trembling hands. But he just looked at it, then set it aside. He looked out at the crowd, the people who had elected him, the people he had lorded over with such petty glee, and he began to speak. His voice was a low, hoarse whisper, but the room fell silent to hear him. "The man who lives on the property to the west," he began, his eyes fixed on some distant point at the back of the room, "is named Michael Jennings. For the past several weeks I have been engaged in a personal dispute with him." He then proceeded to tell them everything. He told them about his demand that I stop fishing, about my refusal. He told them about cutting my father's boat loose and sinking it in the middle of the lake. And then, his voice dropping even lower, he told them about the poison. He told them how he had acquired 50 gallons of commercial-grade algicide, and in the middle of the night, had poured it into my lake, killing every single fish. He confessed to everything. The room was utterly, profoundly silent. The residents were not just angry anymore. They were horrified. They had elected a man who was capable of this level of vindictive environmental evil. They were living next to a man who would poison a lake out of pure spite. They were not just the victims of a water crisis. They were the constituents of a criminal. When Blackwood finished, he looked up, his eyes finally landing on me in the back of the room. There was no anger in his gaze. There was only the hollow, empty look of a man who had lost everything. "And the water problem," he said, his voice barely audible, "is the consequence of my actions. Mr. Jennings is retaliating. He is doing to us what I did to him, and I have no one to blame but myself." He then turned to the board. "I tender my resignation as president of this association, effective immediately." And then he walked off the stage, through a side door, and out of the lives of the people of Cypress Ridge forever. The meeting then proceeded to elect a new interim board. They were a slate of decent, reasonable people who were horrified by what their community had become. Their first act, their very first motion, was to formally apologize to me on behalf of the entire community. Their second motion was to approve a special fund, not to fight me, but to pay for the complete environmental remediation of my lake. They pledged to pay for the dredging, the cleaning, and the restocking of the fish, no matter the cost. It was an act of profound and genuine decency. It was the first sign that the sickness that had infected their community was beginning to heal. After the meeting, as I was walking to my car, I was approached by the new interim president, a woman named Sarah. "Mr. Jennings," she said, her eyes full of a weary sincerity. "What Blackwood did was monstrous. We are so sorry. We will do whatever it takes to make it right." "I know you will," I said. "And as a sign of my own good faith, my agricultural project will be concluding this evening. Your water should be running clear by tomorrow afternoon." She looked at me, a glimmer of a smile on her face. "You're a formidable man, Mr. Jennings," she said. "I'm just glad you're on our side now." "We were never on different sides, Sarah," I replied. "We were just neighbors with a monster in the middle." True to my word, I shut down my tannin operation that night. The next day, the water in Cypress Ridge began to clear. The crisis was over. The community, however, was now faced with a new and, in some ways, more daunting challenge. The public confession of Harrison Blackwood had not just been a local drama. It had been a confession to a series of environmental crimes. The local news picked up the story. The Texas Commission on Environmental Quality, the TCEQ, launched a formal investigation. The Cypress Ridge HOA, as the legal entity that Blackwood had been president of, was now facing potentially hundreds of thousands of dollars in fines for the illegal dumping of a toxic chemical. They had gotten rid of the tyrant, but they were now left with his multi-million-dollar legal and financial mess. The cost of the lake remediation plus the potential TCEQ fines was going to be catastrophic. It would require a massive special assessment, a fee of several $1,000s for every single homeowner. They had won their freedom, but they were now facing bankruptcy. They had traded a tyrant for a financial disaster. This, I realized, was the final unintended consequence of my revenge. My perfect symmetrical justice had inadvertently put 300 innocent families in financial peril, and I knew with a sinking feeling in my gut that my work here was not yet done. I had a moral obligation, not to the HOA, but to my neighbors, to the people who had shown such decency in the wake of Blackwood's madness, to help them find a way out of the mess that he and I had created. I went back to my research, back to the old deeds and the water laws. I was no longer looking for a weapon. I was looking for a solution, and I found it in the same place I had found my original weapon: my grandfather's 1948 senior water rights. The rights didn't just give me a claim to a certain volume of water. They came with a set of responsibilities, what the law called riparian duties. As the senior rights holder, I had a legal duty to act as a responsible steward of the water source, to protect it from degradation and pollution. Blackwood's poisoning of my lake wasn't just an attack on me. It was an attack on the water source itself, and the law gave the senior rights holder broad powers to seek damages, not just for personal losses, but for the environmental harm done to the water resource. I had the legal standing to sue for the cost of the cleanup. But the law also contained a fascinating and deeply obscure provision. It allowed for the establishment of a water stewardship compact, a legal agreement between a senior and junior water rights holder to jointly manage and protect their shared water source. Such a compact could create a new quasi-governmental entity, a water management district with the power to levy its own fees, issue its own bonds, and most importantly, apply for state and federal environmental cleanup grants. This was the solution. It was a legal and financial escape hatch. I approached the new HOA board with a proposal. I would not sue them. Instead, I would work with them. We would form a water stewardship compact. We would create the Cypress Lake Water Management District. This new entity, jointly controlled by me and the HOA, would then take legal responsibility for the cleanup of the lake. And as a newly formed water management district, we would be eligible to apply for a massive grant from the TCEQ's own Environmental Remediation Fund, a fund specifically designed for situations like this. The state, in effect, would pay for the cleanup of a mess that a state-level criminal had created. It was a brilliant, legally sound plan that would save the community from financial ruin. The board, seeing it as the lifeline it was, agreed immediately. The process was complex, requiring a mountain of legal paperwork and a series of public hearings. But with my expertise and their full cooperation, we made it happen. 6 months later, the Cypress Lake Water Management District was officially chartered by the state of Texas. And a month after that, our application for a $2 million environmental cleanup grant was approved. The community was saved. My lake was going to be brought back to life. And the cost would not be borne by the innocent homeowners, but by the state-funded program designed for exactly this purpose. Harrison Blackwood, I learned, had been charged with multiple felonies, including illegal dumping of hazardous materials and causing an environmental disaster. He pleaded guilty and was sentenced to a short prison term, but the financial penalties were staggering. The courts ordered him to pay over $1 million in restitution, not to me and not to the HOA, but to the TCEQ, to replenish the very environmental cleanup fund that was now paying to fix his mess. The symmetry was perfect. His own money was now being used to undo the damage he had done. It was a justice that was more profound and more satisfying than my own personal revenge could have ever been. The restoration of the lake was a slow, beautiful, and deeply cathartic process. The first step was the environmental cleanup, a massive undertaking funded by the state grant. A specialized crew came in and spent 2 months dredging the lake bed, removing the contaminated sediment and restoring the natural clay lining. They aerated the water, re-established the delicate pH balance, and replanted the native aquatic vegetation that had been choked out by the chemical poison. The water, once a milky, lifeless soup, began to clear. The sunlight once again penetrated to the depths, and the slow, patient pulse of life began to return. But the true healing, the one that went beyond the science and the chemistry, came from the community. The creation of the Water Management District had forged a new, powerful bond between me and the residents of Cypress Ridge. We were no longer suspicious neighbors separated by a fence line. We were partners in a shared project of restoration. The new HOA board, led by Sarah, organized a series of community restoration days. Dozens of families from the subdivision would come over to my property on weekends, not as trespassers but as invited guests. We worked side by side, clearing away the dead brush from the shoreline, planting new cypress saplings, and building erosion control barriers. They were, with their own hands, helping to bring back the very ecosystem their former leader had tried to destroy. Their kids, who had once only seen the lake from a distance, now played at its edge, skipping stones across its clearing surface. The final step was the restocking of the fish. This was the part that was most personal to me, the part that felt like a resurrection. The fund paid for thousands of fingerling, bass, bream, and catfish, all sourced from a state hatchery. I invited the entire community to the restocking day. It was a beautiful sunny Saturday morning. The families of Cypress Ridge lined the shore of my lake, and I stood on my small, newly rebuilt wooden dock. I gave a short speech. I didn't talk about Harrison Blackwood or the poison or the revenge. I talked about my father and my grandfather. I talked about what the lake had meant to my family, about the simple, profound joy of casting a line into the water. And then we brought out the fish. The kids, their faces alight with pure, unadulterated joy, were given small buckets filled with the tiny, shimmering fingerlings, and one by one they released them into the water. It was a baptism, a new beginning. It was a promise. It was the moment the lake, my father's heart, started to beat again. In the years that followed, the relationship between my property and the Cypress Ridge community was completely transformed. The fence was still there, but it was no longer a barrier. It was just a line on a map. The Water Management District became a model for rural-suburban cooperation. We worked together on water conservation projects, on wildfire prevention, on protecting the fragile ecosystem we now shared. I became a regular invited speaker at the Cypress Ridge annual meetings, giving updates on the health of the lake and the aquifer. I was no longer the strange, reclusive neighbor. I was a part of their community, and they were a part of mine. My quiet, solitary sanctuary had become something richer, something more complex. It was still the place I came to find peace, but it was no longer a peace born of isolation. It was a peace born of a shared stewardship, of a common purpose. The fishing was better than it had ever been. The new generation of bass grew fat and strong in the clean, healthy water. I would often go out in my boat in the early mornings, the mist rising off the surface of the lake, and I would see my neighbors, the residents of Cypress Ridge, sitting on their back porches, drinking their coffee, watching me. But they weren't watching with suspicion or resentment anymore. They were watching with a quiet, proprietary pride. It wasn't just my lake anymore. In a very real sense, it was ours. Harrison Blackwood was released from prison after serving 18 months of his sentence. He was a broken man, financially and spiritually. He never returned to the area. The house he had owned in Cypress Ridge had been sold to pay for his legal fees and fines. His name became a cautionary tale, a ghost story the neighborhood told to remind itself of the darkness it had overcome. But the story was never really about him. It was about the resilience of a community and the surprising, unexpected ways that a single, malicious act can, in the end, lead to a profound and lasting good. My revenge had been a perfect, symmetrical, and deeply satisfying act of chemical and legal warfare. But it had also been a sterile and lonely thing. The true victory, the one that had brought life back not just to my lake but to me, was not in the act of poisoning, but in the slow, patient, and collaborative work of healing that came after. It was in the shared laughter of children releasing fish into the water. It was in the quiet nod of a neighbor across a fence line. It was in the discovery that the strongest and most resilient ecosystems, both in nature and in human communities, are the ones that are not walled off, but are interconnected, interdependent, and built on a foundation of mutual respect and a shared responsibility for the fragile, precious resources we all depend on. The lake was alive again, and so was I. The final, unexpected ripple of this story spread further than I could have ever imagined. The Cypress Lake Water Management District, the small quasi-governmental entity we had formed out of desperation, became a subject of fascination for water law experts and rural planners across the state. It was a unique, successful model of how a private landowner and a suburban development could jointly manage a shared, critical resource. We were invited to present our model at state-level water conservation conferences. Our story, the strange tale of a poisoned lake and a legal resurrection, became a case study in cooperative hydrology. This newfound attention brought a level of scrutiny to the region's water laws that hadn't existed before. State regulators and legislators began to look more closely at the web of senior and junior water rights, realizing that our situation was not an isolated case, but a potential blueprint for future conflicts in a state where water was becoming an increasingly scarce and valuable commodity. My expertise as a hydrologist was suddenly in high demand. I was appointed to a statewide task force on water resource management, a position that allowed me to advocate for the principles of stewardship and cooperation that we had forged in the crucible of our conflict with Blackwood. It was in this new role, sitting in a hearing at the state capitol, that I had my final, indirect encounter with the ghost of Harrison Blackwood. A new piece of legislation was being debated, a bill that would dramatically increase the financial and criminal penalties for the illegal dumping of hazardous chemicals into private and public waterways. The bill was being championed by a young, fiery state representative from a rural district. During his testimony in support of the bill, he told a story. He told the story of a man in his district, a man he knew, who had his family's private lake, a lake that had been in his family for generations, poisoned by a spiteful, wealthy neighbor. He told the story of the dead fish, of the environmental devastation, of a legacy almost erased by a single act of malice. He told my story. He never used my name or Blackwood's or the name of Cypress Ridge, but he told the story with a passion and a clarity that made the entire hearing room fall silent. He used it as a rallying cry, a perfect visceral example of why the new, stricter penalties were so desperately needed. The bill passed, with overwhelming bipartisan support. It was signed into law a month later. It became known as the Clean Water Legacy Act. And because of it, hundreds of lakes, rivers, and aquifers across the state were now afforded a new, powerful layer of legal protection. A single act of evil, the poisoning of one small 10-acre lake, had ultimately led to a law that would help protect everybody of water in the entire state. It was the last and most profound act of unintended consequence in a story that was full of them. Harrison Blackwood, in his attempt to destroy one small ecosystem, had inadvertently become the poster child for protecting them all. His crime, and my response, had become the catalyst for a lasting, positive change that would benefit millions of people for generations to come. It was a legacy that neither of us could have ever intended, a final, beautiful symmetry that had emerged from the chaos. I still live in the stone house my grandfather built. I still fish in the clear, clean waters of the lake. And sometimes when I'm out on the boat in the quiet of the morning, I think about the strange, winding path that had brought me here. I think about the poison, the revenge, the restoration, and I think about the simple, powerful truth that I had learned, that water, like justice, will always, eventually, find its way. It may be diverted, it may be dammed, it may be poisoned, but in the end, it will always seek its own level. It will always find a way to flow, and it will always, in its own time, wash away the stains of the past, leaving behind a landscape that is cleaner, healthier, and more resilient than it was before.